They left their city to die. That's how it would have looked to the neighbors. The Romans were coming. Jerusalem was bracing for siege. And a small group of Christians, Jewish men, women and children who'd known Jesus or knew people who had, packed what they could carry and walked east, out of the holy city, across the Jordan, away from the temple, away from everything sacred. Their friends called them traitors. Their families called them cowards. And 40 years later, almost every person who stayed in Jerusalem was dead. So what did the Christians know that nobody else did? The year is 66 AD. Judea has been simmering for decades, and now the lid is finally coming off. Roman taxes, Roman soldiers in the streets, a Roman governor who, according to Josephus, robbed the temple treasury to pay his own bills. The breaking point came when Jewish rebels stormed the fortress at Masada, slaughtered the Roman garrison there, and then turned on Jerusalem itself. Inside the city, factions started killing each other. Anyone suspected of cooperating with Rome got dragged into the streets. Anyone suggesting compromise was branded a traitor. The high priest was murdered by his own people. This is the world the early church is trying to survive in. They aren't generals, they aren't politicians. They're a small Jewish movement that worships a crucified Messiah, and they're caught between Roman legions on the outside and zealots on the inside, both of whom have reasons to hate them. You'd think that would be the worst of it. It wasn't. That fall, Rome sent in Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, with a full Roman legion and auxiliary troops. He marched on Jerusalem, broke through the outer defences, and pushed his men right up to the walls of the Temple Mount itself. Then, and Josephus, who lived through this, calls it inexplicable, Gallus turned around. He just left. His army pulled back, and the Jewish rebels chased him down the mountain passes and slaughtered nearly 6,000 Roman soldiers as they retreated. It was the biggest Roman military embarrassment in a generation. For the rebels, this was proof that God was on their side. They started minting coins. They declared independence. They prepared for a glorious final stand. The Christians read it differently, because Jesus had said something. Decades earlier, sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking out at the very temple that was now under siege, he'd told his disciples this: "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." That's Luke chapter 21. The early church knew that text by heart, and now they were looking at it happen in real time. Put yourself in their sandals for a second. You're a Jewish Christian living in Jerusalem in the fall of 66. You believe Jesus is the Messiah. You've been taught his words by people who walked with him, maybe by James, his own brother, who led the church in Jerusalem until he was thrown from the temple wall just a few years before. And the prophecy you've been hearing your whole life just came true. The city was surrounded by armies. The siege was real. The window between the first attack and what's coming next is open, but it won't stay open. What do you do? This is the part that's hard for us to feel from a comfortable distance. Leaving Jerusalem wasn't just leaving a city. It was leaving the temple, the place where God himself was said to dwell. It was leaving the burial sites of the patriarchs. It was leaving everything that, for a Jewish believer, marked you as faithful to the God of Abraham. And the people staying weren't strangers. They were cousins. They were the rabbi who taught you, They were the neighbour whose wedding you danced at. The early church didn't leave because faith was easy. They left because Jesus had told them plainly what was coming, and they believed him enough to walk away from everything else. Now here's where we have to be careful as historians. Our best ancient source for the flight is Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote about it in his church history around 325 AD. That's roughly 2.5 centuries after the events. Epiphanius, writing later still, backs him up and adds some detail. Eusebius says it plainly. The church in Jerusalem received a warning. He calls it a revelation given to approved men, and the believers left the city before the war reached its worst. They crossed the Jordan and settled in a town called Pella in the region called the Decapolis. That's the tradition, and we should be honest about what kind of evidence that is. It's late. It's a single line in a much longer history. We don't have a contemporary eyewitness diary saying, "I was there, I walked the road, here's what we ate." What we have is a memory the church held onto and wrote down generations later, in the same way Jewish communities preserved the memory of the Exodus, or the way American families passed down stories about Ellis Island. So can we say with absolute certainty that every detail happened exactly as Eusebius reports? No. Can we say the early church genuinely remembered fleeing Jerusalem before its destruction? Yes. That memory is old enough and consistent enough that brushing it aside takes more skepticism than the evidence allows. The honest historian sits with both of those at once. If you've never stood on the Mount of Olives and looked east, here's what you need to know. The land drops fast. It falls thousands of feet in just a few miles, down through cracked desert hills, past the Dead Sea, into the deep cut of the Jordan Valley. And then you cross. The Jordan in those days was the border between the world you knew and the world you didn't. East of it, you were no longer in Judea. You were in the Decapolis, a loose network of Greek and Roman cities that had their own pagan temples, their own coins, their own gods. Pella was one of those cities. For a Jewish Christian to walk east across the Jordan was to walk out of the sacred land of promise and into Gentile territory. It would have felt like exile, like giving up, like the prophets had warned about happening to Israel as judgment. And tradition tells us the church did it anyway, with children, with elderly believers, probably in small groups, travelling at night, avoiding Roman patrols and Jewish rebel checkpoints alike. We don't have a travelogue, we don't have names, we don't have routes. What we have is the shape of the thing, a community that heard a warning, believed it cost them everything, and walked out into the dark. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Pella was a real place. Archaeologists have been working there for decades. Today, it's called Tabakat Fahel in modern Jordan, and you can still walk the ruins of the Byzantine churches that were built there centuries after the events we're talking about. But here's the catch. The first century layer at Pella is thin. Refugees don't build monuments. They don't leave behind temples or carved inscriptions saying, "The Jerusalem church passed through here in 67 AD. A few hundred Christian families, arriving with what they could carry, would leave almost no archaeological trace at all. So the dig at Pella can't prove the flight. But it can't disprove it either. What it does confirm is that the geography works. Pella was reachable from Jerusalem. It was outside Roman military focus during the war. It had Gentile-Jewish mixing that would have given a Christian community room to breathe. Every condition you'd need for the tradition to be true is there in the ground. The historian's job here isn't to overclaim or to dismiss, it's to say what we can say. The tradition is plausible, the geography fits, the memory is early enough to matter. Beyond that, we hold it lightly. In August of 70 AD, the Roman general Titus broke through the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was one of the worst urban catastrophes in ancient history. Josephus, who watched it happen, reports starvation so severe that mothers ate their own children. The temple was burned to the ground, the same temple where Jesus had taught, where his parents had brought him as an infant, where his disciples had prayed. The high priesthood ended that day. Sacrifices stopped. The whole structure of Jewish religious life that had stood for centuries collapsed in a single afternoon of fire and smoke. Tens of thousands of people died in the siege. Tens of thousands more were sold into slavery. The historian Tacitus, writing for a Roman audience, gives the casualty count at 600,000. Even cutting that number in half leaves a horror almost impossible to imagine. And the church in Pella heard the news. They had walked away from the city of God, and the city of God had burned. Here's the point. For 3 centuries after Pella, every time a Christian community faced a crisis, Diocletian's persecution, the sack of Rome by the Goths, the long collapse of late antiquity, the Church remembered Pella. Not as a triumph, not as a moment of heroism, as a sober reminder that faithfulness sometimes looks like leaving. The early Christians didn't see themselves as having abandoned Jerusalem. They saw themselves as having preserved something Jerusalem could no longer hold. When the city burned, the church didn't burn with it. It kept teaching, it kept gathering, it kept passing on what it had received. And within a generation, those same Christians and their children were spreading west across the empire, to Antioch, to Ephesus, to Rome. The faith that left Jerusalem in the dark became the faith that 300 years later the empire itself bent the knee to. If that small group of believers had stayed and died in the siege, there is a real argument that we wouldn't have a New Testament. The men who carried the gospel traditions, who collected Paul's letters, who would eventually pass them to Antioch and beyond, many of them were in Pella. One short walk east of the Jordan. One memory the church refused to forget. And the entire shape of Christianity preserved through it. So the question the flight to Pella leaves us with isn't really about Pella. It's about us. What does faithfulness look like when the structures you grew up trusting are coming apart? When the buildings that taught you to pray are no longer safe? When everyone you love is telling you to stay, and a small voice in the back of your head, the voice of a rabbi who said, "Let those in Judea flee," is telling you to go? The early church didn't have a clean answer for that. They had a road east. They had each other. And they had the words of Jesus, spoken from a hillside 40 years before, finally landing in real life with full weight. Discernment isn't fear. Obedience isn't retreat. The God who spoke at the temple is the same God who walked with his people across the Jordan, into a pagan city, into the unknown, and kept the witness alive on the other side. That's the story Pella holds. That's the story the church remembered for 2,000 years. And the road east is still open.